3 weeks ago, I received a letter from my grandfather. That wouldn't be unusual, except for one problem. My grandfather disappeared in Centralia, Pennsylvania in 1984. I was 6 years old. He's been dead for 40 years. The letter had no return address, no stamp, no postmark. Someone had slipped it under my apartment door in the middle of the night. I know because I checked my security camera footage. At 3:47 a.m., a figure in a dark coat appeared in my hallway, bent down, slid something under my door, and walked away. The camera never caught their face. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting I recognized immediately. My mother had kept boxes of my grandfather's old letters, birthday cards he'd sent me as a child. I'd seen that distinctive slanted script hundreds of times. This was his handwriting. There was no doubt. The letter contained just 7 words. They're still here. Don't let them forget. Below those words was a date. October 15th, 1984. The day he vanished. But that wasn't what made me drive 6 hours to Pennsylvania. What made me go was the second item in that envelope. A Polaroid photograph, the kind with the date stamp printed in orange at the bottom. The date read October 3rd, 2024, 3 weeks ago. The photo showed the entrance to an old mine shaft, partially obscured by smoke rising from cracks in the ground. And there, in the corner of the frame, barely visible through the haze, was a figure. A man, elderly, thin, staring directly at the camera. I'd seen enough photos of my grandfather to recognize his posture, the way he stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his pockets. But this man was older than my grandfather ever got. This man had aged 40 years past the day he disappeared. My name is David Mitchell. I'm 50 years old, a civil engineer living in Philadelphia. I have 2 grown children, an ex-wife, and a mortgage. I'm a rational man. I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe what I saw in that photograph. So I took a week off work, packed a bag, and drove to Centralia. Because if there was even the smallest chance my grandfather was still alive, I had to know. I had to find him. This is what I discovered. To understand what happened to my grandfather, you need to understand Centralia. It's not like other ghost towns. It didn't die because the industry left or the economy collapsed. Centralia is dying because the earth beneath it is on fire. In 1962, the town had about 1,400 residents. It was a small coal mining community in Columbia County, Pennsylvania. Most of the men worked in the mines. Families had lived there for generations. My grandfather, Thomas Brennan, was born there in 1928. He went into the mines when he was 16, following his father and his grandfather before him. On May 27, 1962, everything changed. The town council had authorized a cleanup of the local landfill in preparation for Memorial Day. The landfill had been placed in an old strip mine pit. To eliminate the trash, they set it on fire. This was common practice at the time, though obviously dangerous in a town built on coal. The fire spread. It found an opening into an abandoned coal seam beneath the landfill. Once it reached the coal, it began to spread through the labyrinth of mines that honeycombed the ground beneath Centralia. Coal, once ignited underground, is nearly impossible to extinguish. It doesn't need much oxygen. It can burn for centuries. At first, the town didn't take it seriously. They'd dealt with small mine fires before. But this one was different. It kept spreading deeper and wider, following the coal veins like blood vessels. By the late 1960s, the ground was hot to the touch in certain areas. Smoke and steam rose from cracks in the earth. The air smelled of sulfur. In 1979, the mayor of Centralia checked the temperature of gasoline in the underground tanks at a local gas station. The reading was 172 degrees Fahrenheit. Gasoline vapors can ignite at around 500 degrees. The town was sitting on top of a bomb. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was walking in his grandmother's backyard when the ground opened beneath him. He fell into a sinkhole 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep, filled with toxic fumes. He managed to grab a tree root and hold on until his cousin pulled him out. He was lucky. The carbon monoxide levels in that hole would have killed him in minutes. That incident made national news. The federal government finally paid attention. In 1984, Congress allocated $42 million to relocate Centralia's residents. Most people took the buyout and left. By 1992, the government used eminent domain to condemn all the buildings. The post office closed. The zip code was revoked. But some people refused to leave. They fought the government, went to court and lost. Most eventually gave up. Today, as of 2024, only about 4 people still live in Centralia, in houses they refuse to abandon. The fire is still burning. Scientists estimate it has enough coal to burn for another 250 years. The town is a ghost, kept alive by an underground inferno. My grandfather was one of the stubborn ones. Even after most people left, he stayed. My mother begged him to move in with us, but he refused. He said Centralia was his home, and he'd rather die there than run away from a little smoke. My mother was a single parent. My father had left when I was 2 years old. I barely remembered him. So my grandfather became my father figure. He'd drive 2 hours to Reading every few weeks to visit us. He taught me how to fish, how to fix a car, how to play poker. He was a quiet man, never said much, but when he spoke, you listened. I remember the last time I saw him clearly. It was October 1984. I was 6 years old. He came for Sunday dinner. My mother made pot roast, his favorite, but he barely touched his food. He kept looking out the window, as if he expected to see something there. My mother noticed. She asked if he was okay. He didn't answer at first. Then he said something strange. He said, "Some things should stay buried, Helen. We dug too deep." My mother thought he was talking about the coal mines, about how the mining company had gone too deep and caused the fire. But there was something in his voice that didn't sound like he was talking about coal. After dinner, he hugged me goodbye. It was a long hug, longer than usual. I remember thinking it was weird. Then he left. I watched his car disappear down the street. 3 days later, on October 15th, 1984, he vanished. His neighbor called my mother. She said my grandfather's car was parked in his driveway, but his front door was wide open. She'd gone inside to check on him. The house was empty. Coffee was still in the pot, still warm. The television was on. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen table. My mother called the police. They searched the house, the surrounding area, the accessible parts of the mine system. They found nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no note, nothing. The official theory was that he'd been overcome by carbon monoxide. The gas could seep into homes through cracks in the foundation. It was odorless, invisible. People exposed to it became confused, disoriented. They wandered off and collapsed. The police assumed my grandfather had walked into the woods or fallen into one of the unstable areas where the ground had collapsed into the burning mines below. They searched for 2 weeks. They brought in dogs, a helicopter, volunteers from nearby towns. They found nothing. The case went cold. My grandfather was declared missing, presumed dead. We held a funeral with an empty casket. My mother never recovered. She blamed herself for not forcing him to leave Centralia sooner. She died in 2003 from cancer, but I think grief killed her long before that. I grew up, went to college, became a civil engineer. I got married, had 2 kids, got divorced. Life moved on. I thought about my grandfather sometimes, but the pain had faded into a dull ache. I accepted that I'd never know what really happened to him until that letter arrived, until I saw that photograph, until I realized that maybe, just maybe, he'd never left Centralia at all. The drive to Centralia took 6 hours. I left Philadelphia at dawn, stopped once for gas and coffee, and arrived in Columbia County around noon. The closer I got, the more anxious I felt. I hadn't been back since I was a child. I wasn't sure what I'd find. Route 61 used to run straight through Centralia, connecting it to nearby towns. In 1993, the state closed a section of the highway because the underground fire had made it too unstable. That section is now called the Graffiti Highway. It's become a weird tourist attraction. People come from all over to spray paint the cracked asphalt. I parked near the Graffiti Highway and got out. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. A faint scent of sulfur and smoke, like standing downwind from a campfire. The second thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through dead trees. I walked into what used to be the center of town. There are no buildings left, just empty lots overgrown with vegetation. You can see the outlines of foundations, driveways leading to nowhere, sidewalks cracked and tilted. Street signs still stand at intersections, marking streets that no longer exist. And everywhere, smoke. It rises from cracks in the ground, thin wisps of white and grey, drifting in the breeze. In some places, the earth is stained orange and yellow from sulfur deposits. In winter, the snow melts in patches where the ground is warmest, creating bizarre patterns across the landscape. I found where my grandfather's house used to be. I remembered the address, 63 South Paxton Street. There's nothing there now. The house was demolished in the 1990s, just an empty lot with scrubby grass and a few bricks half buried in the dirt. I stood there for a long time, trying to imagine what it had looked like when my grandfather lived there. I remembered bits and pieces: a green front door, a porch swing, a garage with a rusty basketball hoop. But the memories were faded, unreliable. I'd been so young. I pulled out the Polaroid from the envelope. The photo showed the entrance to a mine shaft, smoke rising around it. I needed to find that location. I'd done research before coming here. I'd spent hours in the Pennsylvania State Archives, reading old mining maps, accident reports, geological surveys. Centralia sits on top of a massive network of coal mines. Some were legal, operated by companies. Others were bootleg holes, dug illegally by miners trying to make extra money. The maps showed dozens of entry points scattered across the area. Mineshaft 7 was on the eastern edge of town, about half a mile from where my grandfather's house had stood. According to the records, it had been sealed in 1956 after a partial collapse. But the Deep Crew, I'd learned about them in my research, had found ways into sealed sections. They'd mapped routes the company didn't know existed. Before heading to the mine, I needed information. I needed to talk to someone who'd known my grandfather, someone who'd been in Centralia back then. That's when I remembered John Lakitis Jr. I'd read about him in news articles. He was one of the last holdouts, one of the few people who still lived in Centralia. He'd been fighting the government for decades, refusing to leave. In 2013, he and a few other residents reached a settlement that allowed them to stay in their homes for the rest of their lives, though the borough itself had been officially dissolved. I found his house on the south side of town. It was one of only a handful of structures still standing. It looked frozen in time. A small, single-story home with white siding, a chain-link fence, and a well-maintained yard. Smoke rose from a crack in the street about 20 feet away. I knocked on the door. It took a while, but eventually an elderly man answered. He was probably in his early 80s, thin, with thick glasses and suspicious eyes. I introduced myself. I told him I was Thomas Brennan's grandson. His expression changed immediately. Not to warmth or welcome, but to something else. Recognition, maybe, or caution. He invited me in. The inside of his house was like stepping into 1975. Wood paneling on the walls, shag carpet, a television from the 1980s, shelves filled with old books and VHS tapes, photographs everywhere, covering nearly every surface. Pictures of Centralia before the fire, when it was a thriving town. Families that no longer existed. Children who were now elderly or dead. We sat in his living room. I showed him the letter and the Polaroid. He stared at them for a long time, his hands shaking slightly. Then he said, I wondered when someone would finally come asking about the deep crew. That's when everything started to make sense. John told me that in 1978, a group of 12 miners, my grandfather among them, had started exploring the abandoned sections of the mine system. They called themselves the Deep Crew. They weren't supposed to be down there. The company had sealed those areas decades earlier, citing instability. But the Deep Crew didn't believe that story. They thought the company was hiding something. So they went down on their own time, without permission. They brought their own equipment, drew their own maps. They went deeper than anyone had gone in 40 years. What they found changed everything. In the deepest section, far below the normal mining operations, they discovered a chamber. It wasn't natural. It had been carved out, reinforced with concrete and steel. Inside were pieces of equipment, documents, and evidence of something John described as an experiment that went very wrong. John didn't know all the details. The Deep Crew had kept most of what they found secret, even from their families. But he knew enough to understand that what they discovered was dangerous, and he knew what happened to them afterward. He pulled out an old photograph from a drawer. It showed 12 men standing outside Mine Shaft 7, wearing work clothes and hard hats. My grandfather was in the center, unsmiling, his arms crossed. John pointed at each face and told me their fates. Michael Kowalski, dead, March 1982. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his home, ruled accidental. James Sullivan, dead, August 1982. Car accident on Route 61. Single vehicle collision. No witnesses. Robert Androwski, disappeared, November 1982. Last seen leaving a bar in Ashland. Never found. Peter Dombrowski, dead, January 1983. House fire. Burned alive in his sleep. Frank Nowak, dead, June 1983. Fell down his basement stairs. Broken neck. Ruled accidental. Joseph Urek, disappeared, September 1983. Went for a walk in the woods. Never came back. Stanley Wojciechowski, dead, December 1983. Suicide by hanging, left no note. Edward Kaminsky, dead, March 1984. Heart attack. Found dead in his car near the mine entrance. Walter Tomczyk, disappeared, May 1984. Last seen going into Mine Shaft 7. Never returned. Henry Pawlowski, dead, August 1984. Drowned in the Susquehanna River. Ruled accidental. Thomas Brennan, my grandfather, disappeared, October 1984. Anthony Olszewski, dead, January 1985. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Found in his garage with his car running. Ruled suicide. 12 men. All dead or missing within 3 years of discovering that chamber. John said most of the deaths were ruled accidents or suicides. The police saw no connection, but the timing was impossible to ignore. I asked John if he thought they'd been murdered. He shook his head slowly. I think they were silenced, he said, but not by people. He told me about the strange things that started happening after the Deep Crew made their discovery. Equipment malfunctioning for no reason. Sounds coming from the sealed sections at night. Whistling, voices, footsteps. Men seeing things in the darkness that shouldn't be there. And then the fire started in 1962. Most people think it was an accident. Trash burning in the old landfill. But John had a different theory. He thought the fire was set deliberately. Not by the town, but by someone trying to make sure whatever was in that deep chamber stayed buried forever. Burn hot enough, long enough, and eventually even concrete and steel turned to ash. But the plan failed. The fire didn't destroy the deep sections. It made them inaccessible, yes, but they remained intact, preserved under a blanket of heat and toxic gas. And the Deep Crew knew how to get down there. They'd mapped routes the company didn't know about. I asked John if he thought my grandfather could still be alive down there after 40 years. He looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Tommy Brennan was the smartest of them all. If anyone could survive in those tunnels, it would be him. But surviving down there for that long, that's not the same as living, son. That's not the same as living at all." Before I left, John gave me something, a hand-drawn map. old and fragile, copied from one my grandfather had made back in 1979. It showed a route into mine shaft 7 that bypassed the main sealed entrance, a ventilation shaft hidden in the woods, partially collapsed but still accessible if you knew where to look. He also gave me a warning. On the back of the map, written in my grandfather's handwriting, were 3 rules. If you hear whistling, go back immediately. If you see lights that aren't yours, don't follow them. If you find the red door, do not open it. I asked John what the red door was. He said he didn't know. None of the deep crew had ever explained it, but every one of them had mentioned it before they died or disappeared. They all said the same thing. Whatever was behind the red door had to stay closed. I thanked John and left. It was already late afternoon. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. Every rational part of my brain told me to leave, to call the authorities, to let this mystery die with my grandfather. But I couldn't. I'd spent 40 years wondering what happened to him. I wasn't leaving without answers. I went back to my car and opened the trunk. I'd come prepared. Gas mask, heavy-duty flashlights, a digital camera, rope, first aid kit, a copy of the old mining maps, and a gun, a Glock 19 I'd bought years ago for home defense and barely ever fired. I didn't know what I'd find down there, but I wanted to be ready. I drove to the eastern edge of town, parked in an overgrown lot, and started walking into the woods. The forest around Centralia is dying. The trees are thin and pale, their bark blackened in places. The ground is warm underfoot, almost hot in certain spots. Very little grows here. The undergrowth is sparse, just dead leaves and patches of sickly grass. I followed John's map, using my phone's GPS to navigate. The ventilation shaft was about a quarter mile into the woods, in an area dense with dead trees and thick with smoke. I almost walked right past it. It was a metal grating, about 3 feet in diameter, half buried in leaves and ash. Rust had eaten through parts of the metal, creating jagged holes. The grating was secured with a heavy padlock, but someone had cut through it years ago. The lock hung open, useless. I pulled the grating aside. A wave of hot air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of sulfur and something else, something organic and rotten. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it down. The shaft descended at a steep angle, maybe 45 degrees. A metal ladder was bolted to the side, though many of the rungs were missing or bent. It disappeared into darkness. I put on my gas mask, checked my flashlight, and started climbing down. The temperature rose quickly. Within 50 feet, I was sweating. The metal ladder was hot to the touch, even through my gloves. The walls of the shaft were slick with condensation. I could hear water dripping somewhere below, each drop echoing. At 100 feet, the shaft leveled off slightly. At 200 feet, it opened into a horizontal tunnel, part of the original mine system. I stepped off the ladder and stood in the tunnel. The ceiling was low, maybe 6 feet high. The walls were reinforced with old timber beams, many of them charred black from the heat. The floor was covered in a fine layer of grey ash that puffed up with each step. I checked John's map. According to it, I needed to follow this tunnel for about 200 yards, then take the third right turn. That would lead me towards Section 7D, the area where the deep crew had made their discovery. I started walking. The silence down there is hard to describe. It's not complete silence. There are sounds, the creak of old timber, the hiss of steam escaping from cracks, the distant rumble of shifting earth. But there are no human sounds, no voices, no machinery, just the dead, hollow quiet of a place that's been abandoned for decades. The tunnel branched frequently. Most of the side passages were blocked with rubble or sealed with concrete walls. Warnings were painted on some of the walls. Danger, do not enter. Unstable. Authorized personnel only. I ignored them and kept walking. At the third intersection, I turned right as the map instructed. This tunnel was narrower, the ceiling lower. I had to duck in places. The temperature continued to rise. My gas mask fogged up. I wiped it clear and kept going. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh footprints in the ash on the floor. Boot prints, size 11 or 12. A man's footprints. They led deeper into the tunnel, heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped and stared at them. They couldn't be old. Ash this fine would be disturbed by even a slight breeze. These prints were recent, hours old maybe, a day at most. Someone else was down here. I thought about turning back, but I'd come this far. I needed to know. I followed the footprints. The tunnel curved left, then right, descending gradually. The walls here showed evidence of the fire. In some places, the rock itself had melted, creating smooth, glassy surfaces. The heat was intense. I was soaked with sweat. My breathing was loud inside the gas mask. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, I reached a heavy steel door. It was half open. The door was marked with faded yellow paint. Authorized personnel only. Section 7D, restricted access. The footprints led through. I pushed the door wider. It groaned on rusted hinges, the sound echoing through the tunnel. I stepped through. The space beyond was enormous. It was a chamber, easily the size of a large warehouse, but it wasn't a natural cavern. Every surface had been carved with precision, the walls reinforced with concrete panels. Steel support beams crisscrossed the ceiling. This wasn't a mining operation. This was something else entirely. And it was filled with equipment. Tables made of stainless steel, bolted to the floor. Shelves lined with glass containers, most of them broken now. Large cylindrical tanks made of reinforced metal, labeled with chemical symbols I didn't recognize. Control panels with dead gauges and switches. Thick cables running along the walls, connecting machinery that had been silent for 80 years. But the most disturbing part was the paperwork. Thousands of pages scattered across the floor, piled on tables, stuffed into filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open. Documents that had somehow survived decades in this heat, preserved by the dry air. I picked up the nearest page. The letterhead read, Harrison Chemical Corporation, Defense Contract, 7D 1943. I started reading. The document described a project funded by the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service. The goal was to develop incapacitating agents, chemical weapons that could disable enemy soldiers without killing them. The advantage was obvious. You could occupy a city or military installation without destroying it, without creating martyrs, without the moral weight of mass casualties. The facility here, deep beneath Centralia, had been chosen because of its isolation and the existing mine infrastructure. Between 1942 and 1945, Harrison Chemical Corporation conducted dozens of tests on various compounds. I picked up another document. This one was a test report, dated July 1943. It described the effects of something called Compound 7 on test subjects. The subjects were listed only as Animal Group C. The effects included extreme agitation, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, progressive neurological damage, and eventual death. I kept reading. Compound 7 was considered a failure because it was too potent and the effects were irreversible. Subjects exposed to even small amounts experienced permanent psychological damage. The compound was also remarkably stable. It didn't degrade over time. It could remain active in sealed environments for years, perhaps indefinitely. Then I found the incident report. On August 18, 1943, there was an accident. One of the containment chambers failed. Compound 7 leaked into the facility's ventilation system. 12 workers were exposed before the system could be shut down and sealed. The report described what happened to them over the next 6 months. First came the auditory hallucinations, whistling sounds, voices calling their names. Then the paranoia. They became convinced they were being watched, followed, hunted. Some became violent. One attacked a colleague with a wrench, claiming the man was one of them and not real. By February 1944, all 12 workers were dead, some from suicide, some from accidents caused by their delusions. 2 simply disappeared. walked into the woods surrounding Centralia, and were never found. The facility was sealed immediately. The families of the dead workers were paid settlements and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. The official story was a mining accident. The documents were classified, and then the project was shut down. The chamber was abandoned, locked, forgotten. The entrance was sealed with concrete. For 40 years, it sat here in the dark, undisturbed, until the deep crew found it. I looked around the chamber with new understanding. When my grandfather and his friends broke through that seal in 1979, they didn't just discover a forgotten facility, they exposed themselves to Compound 7. That's when I heard the sound. A faint whistling coming from somewhere in the darkness at the far end of the chamber. I froze. The whistling was melodic, almost musical, a tune I didn't recognize. It echoed off the concrete walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I remembered the warning on the map: if you hear whistling, go back immediately. But I didn't go back. I don't know why. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was denial. Maybe after coming this far, I needed to see this through to the end. I walked toward the sound. The chamber extended further than I'd initially thought. The far end was shrouded in darkness, beyond the reach of my flashlight. As I walked, I passed more equipment, more tables, more documents. I saw chambers with reinforced glass windows, rooms within rooms, designed to contain something dangerous. The whistling grew louder. And then I saw him, a figure, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, barely visible in the darkness. He was thin, emaciated really. His clothes were tattered, little more than rags. His hair was long and white, hanging past his shoulders. His skin had a grayish pallor stretched tight over his skull. But I recognized him. It was my grandfather. He was still whistling, the same tune over and over. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. I said his name. Grandpa Tom. The whistling stopped. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, and looked at me. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles, but they were aware. He saw me. "David," he said. His voice was a rasp, like he hadn't spoken in years. "Little David, you shouldn't have come." I took off my gas mask so he could see my face clearly. "It's me, Grandpa. I got your letter. I came to find you." He stared at me for a long moment, then he smiled, a horrible, broken smile that showed missing teeth. "I didn't send a letter," he said. My blood went cold. "But I received a letter, your handwriting and a photo, a Polaroid from 3 weeks ago." He shook his head slowly. "I can't leave this place, David. I haven't left in 40 years. If someone sent you a letter, it wasn't me." "Then who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. He was shorter than I remembered, bent with age. He couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. "You need to leave," he said. "You need to leave now, before—" He stopped mid-sentence, his head tilting like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Before what?" I asked. "Before they know you're here." "Who's they?" He pointed toward a tunnel at the far end of the chamber, one I hadn't noticed before. Above the entrance, painted in faded red letters, were the words, "Containment Area, Authorized Access Only." "The first 12, he said, "the ones who died in 1943, they're still here. They never left." I stared at him. "Grandpa, those people died 80 years ago." "I know," he said. "But Compound 7, it doesn't just affect the living, David. It seeps into everything, the walls, the air, the stone. And when people die here, exposed to it, they don't leave. Not really. They become part of it, part of the place." I didn't know what to say. Was this the ramblings of a man who'd spent 40 years alone in the dark, slowly losing his mind? Or was there truth to what he was saying? "I've seen them," he continued, "walking through the tunnels at night, whistling, calling my name. Sometimes they look real. Sometimes they're just shapes, shadows. But they're here. They've always been here. Why didn't you leave?" I asked. Why did you stay down here for 40 years? He looked at me with sad, ancient eyes. Because I had to make sure no one else found this place. I had to guard it. All of us did, the deep crew. We all understood what would happen if this got out. If someone tried to weaponize Compound 7 again, or if it leaked into the water supply, or if... He stopped, listening again. What is it? I asked. They know you're here now. They can smell the living. You need to go, now. I'm not leaving without you. I can't leave, David. If I leave, there's no one to watch the red door. What's behind the red door? He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me toward a different tunnel away from the containment area. Go, he said. Follow this tunnel. It leads to an old emergency exit. It comes out about half a mile from where you entered. Go now. Grandpa, go! And then I heard it. Footsteps. Multiple footsteps echoing from the containment area. Slow, deliberate, getting closer and whistling. Not one voice but many, a chorus of whistles, all in perfect harmony. My grandfather pushed me toward the tunnel. Run, he said. I ran through the darkness, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind me, I could hear them, the footsteps, the whistling, getting closer. I didn't look back. The tunnel twisted and turned, ascending gradually. My lungs burned, my legs ached. But I kept running. The whistling grew fainter. The footsteps faded. Either I was outpacing them or they'd stopped following. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I saw it. A metal ladder leading upward to a circular hatch in the ceiling. The emergency exit. I climbed the ladder, pushed the hatch open, and pulled myself out. I emerged in the middle of the woods about 100 yards from where I'd entered. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and red. The air outside felt shockingly cold after the heat of the tunnels. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping, pulling off my gas mask. I'd made it out, but my grandfather was still down there. I lay there for a long time, catching my breath, trying to process what I'd seen. Was it real? Had I actually encountered the ghosts of workers who died 80 years ago? Or had I been exposed to Compound 7 and everything I'd experienced was a hallucination? I didn't know. I still don't know. What I do know is that my grandfather had been down there for 40 years, alone, standing guard over something he believed was dangerous. Whether that danger was real or imagined didn't matter. He believed it, and that belief had kept him in that darkness for 4 decades. I eventually stood up and made my way back to my car. I drove to a motel in Ashland, about 10 miles away. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the room, staring at the letter and the Polaroid, trying to understand. If my grandfather didn't send the letter, who did? The next morning, I went back to see John Lakitis. I needed answers. I needed to understand what I'd seen down there, whether it was real or if I was losing my mind. John opened the door looking more tired than the day before. He invited me in without a word, as if he'd been expecting me. I told him everything, the chamber, the documents, the Compound 7, finding my grandfather, the whistling, the footsteps. The things he said about the first 12 workers still being down there. John listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and went to a closet in the hallway. He pulled out a cardboard box, old and worn, and brought it back to the living room. These belonged to my father, he said, opening the box. He worked in the mines for 30 years. He knew about the deep crew. He knew what they found down there. Inside the box were photographs, newspaper clippings, and a leather journal. John handed me the journal. Read it, he said. It explains everything. I opened the journal. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The first entry was dated November 1979. It was written by John's father, Stephen Lakitis. He'd been a supervisor at the mine, someone who'd known my grandfather and the other members of the deep crew. According to the journal, when the deep crew discovered the sealed chamber in 1979, they initially thought they'd found something valuable, maybe gold, or rare minerals, or buried equipment they could salvage and sell. Instead, they found the Harrison Chemical Facility. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at, but one of them, Edward Kaminsky, had served in the army and recognized some of the equipment. He'd worked in a chemical weapons disposal unit after the war. He knew enough to realize they'd stumbled onto something classified and dangerous. The deep crew debated what to do. Some wanted to report it to the authorities. Others wanted to keep it secret, afraid they'd be prosecuted for trespassing in sealed areas. My grandfather argued that they needed to understand what they'd found before making any decisions. So they went back. Multiple times, they photographed everything. They took samples of documents. They tried to piece together what had happened there. That's when they started getting sick. The first symptoms appeared within 3 weeks. Headaches, insomnia, a constant ringing in their ears. Then came the auditory hallucinations, whistling sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, voices calling their names when no one was there. They realized they'd been exposed to something in that chamber, something that was still active after 35 years. According to Stephen Lokaitis' journal, the deep crew tried to seal the chamber again to prevent anyone else from being exposed. They used concrete steel beams, whatever they could find. But by then, the damage was done. The Compound 7 was already in their systems. The hallucinations grew worse. Michael Kowalski started claiming his wife had been replaced by an imposter. James Sullivan said he could hear people walking inside his walls. Robert Andrewski became convinced the government was monitoring him, that agents were following him everywhere he went. One by one, they deteriorated. Some took their own lives, unable to bear the constant paranoia and hallucinations. Some died in accidents caused by their compromised mental states. Some simply disappeared, walking into the mines or the woods and never returning. Stephen Lokaitis wrote that he tried to help them. He urged them to see doctors, psychiatrists, but they refused. They were terrified that if they revealed what they'd found, they'd be locked up or disappeared by the government. My grandfather, according to the journal, was the most lucid of the group for the longest time. He understood what was happening to them. He documented everything in his own notebooks, trying to find a pattern, trying to understand the mechanism of Compound 7, and he came to a conclusion that terrified him. The compound didn't just cause hallucinations, it fundamentally altered perception. People exposed to it began to perceive things that existed in a state outside normal reality, echoes, imprints, residual patterns left behind by intense trauma or emotion. The 12 workers who died in 1943 had left such imprints. Their deaths had been so traumatic, so saturated with fear and confusion, that Compound 7 had somehow preserved those patterns, and people exposed to the compound could perceive them. In other words, the ghosts were real. But they weren't supernatural. They were a side effect of a chemical weapon that had poisoned both the living and the dead. My grandfather realized that if this knowledge got out, if someone tried to study or weaponize Compound 7, the consequences would be catastrophic. So he made a decision. He would stay in the mines. He would guard the chamber. He would make sure no one else ever found it. The last entry in Stephen Lokaitis' journal was dated October 14th, 1984, one day before my grandfather disappeared. It read, "Tommy came to see me today. He said he's going down into the deep sections and he's not coming back up. He said someone has to stand watch to make sure the red door stays closed. I asked him what's behind the red door. He said, the source, the place where they made it, the room where the first 12 died. He said if that room is ever opened, the concentration of Compound 7 inside would be enough to contaminate the entire water table. Thousands of people would be exposed." I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. He shook my hand, thanked me for my friendship and left. I don't think I'll ever see him again. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. "He chose to stay down there," I said quietly. "He sacrificed 40 years of his life to protect people from something they don't even know exists. John nodded. That's who your grandfather was. That's who all of them were. They made mistakes. They went where they shouldn't have gone. But when they realized the danger, they did everything they could to contain it, even if it meant giving up their lives. I asked John the question that had been haunting me since I found the letter. If my grandfather didn't send me that letter and photo, who did? John was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you need to consider the possibility that your grandfather isn't the only one still down there. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? The deep crew had 12 members, John said. Your grandfather was the last to disappear, but he wasn't the only one who went down into those tunnels and never came back. Robert Androwski, Joseph Urich, Walter Tomczyk, they all disappeared near the mines. Their bodies were never found. You think they're down there too? Still alive? I think some of them might be, John said. Living in the tunnels like your grandfather. Standing watch, making sure no one opens that red door. But why would one of them send me a letter? Why would they want me to come down there? John looked at me with grave eyes. Maybe they're dying. Maybe after 40 years, they're finally reaching the end, and they need someone to take their place. The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. They want me to stay down there, to become the next guardian. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. I spent the rest of that day thinking. I drove around Centralia, walking through the empty streets, trying to decide what to do. The rational thing would be to report everything to the authorities. Tell them about the chamber, the Compound 7, the men who'd been living in the tunnels for decades. Let the government handle it. But I knew what would happen if I did that. The place would be swarmed with hazmat teams, chemical weapons specialists, military personnel. They'd seal everything, classify everything, and my grandfather would spend whatever time he had left in a government facility being studied and interrogated. He'd given up 40 years to protect people. He deserved better than that. So I made a different choice. That evening I went back to the emergency exit. I brought supplies, food, water, batteries, medical supplies, warm clothes, everything I could carry. I descended into the tunnels one last time. I found my grandfather where I'd left him, sitting against the wall in the main chamber. He looked weaker than before, his breathing shallow. I sat down next to him and gave him the supplies. I'm not here to take you out, I said. I know you won't leave, but I brought you things to make it easier. He looked at the supplies, then at me. His eyes were clearer than they'd been the day before. You understand now, he said. It wasn't a question. I read Stephen Lakaitis' journal. I know why you stayed. I know about the red door. He nodded slowly. I don't have much time left, David. Maybe a year, maybe less. When I'm gone, there'll be no one to watch this place. What about the others? The other members of the deep crew who disappeared? A sad smile crossed his face. Robert died in 1992. Joseph died in 2001. Walter died in 2015. I buried them all in a side tunnel, gave them as much dignity as I could. It's just me now. Then let me bring someone, I said. Let me find people who can help, people we can trust. No, he said firmly. The more people who know, the greater the risk. This secret has to die with me. The fire will eventually consume everything down here, the chamber, the documents, the Compound 7. Another 100 years, maybe 200, and it'll all be ash. The fire is doing what we couldn't. It's destroying the evidence, making sure this can never be used again. But in the meantime, I watch the red door, and when I can't anymore, I seal this chamber for good. I've been stockpiling explosives from old mining supplies. When my time comes, I'll bring down the tunnels, bury everything under 1,000 tons of rock. No one will ever find this place again. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to tell him there had to be another way. But looking at him, at this man who'd given up everything for a secret he couldn't share, I realized he'd made peace with his choice a long time ago. We sat together in the darkness for a while, not speaking. Finally, I asked him the question I'd been afraid to ask. Do you regret it? staying down here all these years. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I regret not saying goodbye to you and your mother properly. I regret the pain my disappearance caused. But staying here, protecting people from this, no, I don't regret that. Some things are bigger than one life, David. Some secrets are worth keeping, no matter the cost." I stayed with him for another hour. We talked about my mother, about my kids, about the life I'd built. He seemed happy to know that the family had continued, that life had gone on without him. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the emergency exit tunnel. We stood at the entrance, and for a moment he looked like the grandfather I remembered from childhood. Strong, certain, unafraid. "Don't come back," he said. "Don't try to find me again. Let me do what I need to do. I can't just leave you here to die alone." "I'm not alone," he said, and for a moment I thought I heard whistling in the distance. "I've had plenty of company for 40 years. I didn't know if he meant the ghosts or something else. I didn't ask. I hugged him. He felt fragile in my arms, like he might break. Then I let go, put on my gas mask, and climbed the ladder. I didn't look back. That was 3 months ago. I returned to Philadelphia, went back to my job, resumed my normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. How could it? I'd found my grandfather after 40 years and left him to die alone in the darkness. I told my kids that their great-grandfather had passed away, that I'd found closure. They accepted that. They didn't need to know the truth. I kept the journal Stephen Lokitis had given me. I kept my grandfather's letter and the Polaroid. I kept the maps. Everything is in a safety deposit box at my bank now, along with a letter I wrote explaining everything. Instructions say it's not to be opened until 2074, 50 years from now. By then, the fire will have done its work. The chamber will be destroyed. The secret will be safe. But I think about him every day. I wonder if he's still down there, still watching that red door. I wonder what he sees in the darkness, whether the ghosts are real or just the product of a dying brain poisoned by chemicals. I've done research on Compound 7. It doesn't exist in any official records. The Harrison Chemical Corporation dissolved in 1947. There's no evidence they ever worked on chemical weapons. Either the records were destroyed, or they were so highly classified they've never been declassified. But I've found scattered references, obscure academic papers, declassified memos with heavy redactions, testimony from congressional hearings in the 1970s about unethical government experiments, pieces of a puzzle that suggest my grandfather's story was true. I've also looked into the other members of the Deep Crew. I found their death certificates, their obituaries. Every single one of them died under unusual circumstances. The pattern is undeniable once you know to look for it, and I've researched the fire itself. The official story is that it was an accident, trash burning that got out of control. But I've found hints of something else. A report from a local firefighter in 1962 who claimed the fire seemed to start simultaneously in multiple locations, which wouldn't make sense if it was just trash burning. A memo from a state investigator noting irregularities in the burn pattern. Nothing conclusive, nothing that would hold up in court. But enough to make me wonder. If my grandfather was right, if someone deliberately started that fire to bury the Compound 7 facility, then Centralia's tragedy was intentional. 1,400 people lost their homes because of a government cover-up, but I can't prove it. And even if I could, what good would it do? The people responsible are long dead. The town is already gone. Justice, if that's what you'd call it, is impossible. So I've kept quiet, just like my grandfather did, just like the Deep Crew did. Because some secrets are bigger than the need for truth. Last week I drove back to Centralia. I didn't go into the mines. I just walked through the empty streets, stood on the graffiti highway, watched the smoke rising from the earth. I went to the woods where the emergency exit was hidden. The hatch was sealed now. Someone had welded a steel plate over it. Either my grandfather had done it himself, or the tunnels had collapsed naturally. Either way, there's no going back down there now. I stood there for a long time, looking at that sealed hatch, knowing my grandfather was somewhere below in the darkness. I wanted to say something, some kind of goodbye or acknowledgement, but words felt inadequate, so I just stood there in silence and then I left. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know if he's watching the red door or if he's already gone. I don't know if he succeeded in burying that chamber or if it's still down there waiting for someone else to find it someday. What I do know is this: Thomas Brennan was a hero. Not the kind who gets medals or monuments or newspaper articles. The kind who suffers in silence, who sacrifices everything without recognition, who protects people who will never know they needed protecting. He gave up 40 years of his life, his daughter's death, his grandson's wedding, the birth of his great-grandchildren, everything that makes life worth living, to guard a secret that could have harmed thousands. That's what real heroism looks like, not glory or fame, just quiet sacrifice in the dark. I think about all the people like him out there, people standing watch over secrets we don't know exist, people bearing burdens we'll never understand, people who choose duty over happiness, protection over peace. They exist in the margins of history, in the gaps between official records, in the shadows of classified files. We walk past their sacrifices every day without knowing. My grandfather was one of them, and now his story is one of countless stories that will never be told, can never be told, because the telling would undo the sacrifice. So I'm telling it here, in this way, to these people who will never know where Centralia really is, will never be able to find that chamber, will never open that red door. I'm telling it because someone should know, someone should remember, even if it's just as a story, a cautionary tale, a piece of fiction that might be true. Thomas Brennan was my grandfather. He disappeared in Centralia, Pennsylvania in October 1984. The official record says he died from carbon monoxide poisoning, his body lost in the labyrinth of burning mines. But I know the truth. He didn't die in 1984. He lived for 40 more years in the darkness, alone, standing watch over a door that should never be opened, protecting the world from a mistake made 80 years ago. And when he finally did die, because surely by now he must have, he died doing what he believed was right. He died with purpose. He died a guardian. I hope that was enough for him. I hope that in those last moments, alone in the dark, he felt proud of what he'd accomplished. I hope he found peace, because God knows he earned it. The fire in Centralia still burns. Scientists estimate it will burn for another 200 years. By then, everything my grandfather protected will be ash. The chamber, the documents, the Compound 7, the bodies of the 12 workers who died in 1943, the bodies of the deep crew members who died standing watch. All of it will burn, all of it will be forgotten. Maybe that's for the best. Some things should stay buried. Some secrets should die in the dark. Some doors should never be opened. My grandfather understood that. He lived it. He died for it. And now I carry that knowledge alone, this burden of knowing something I can never prove, never share, never act upon. It's a small burden compared to what he carried. But I carry it willingly, because it's all I can do to honor his sacrifice. So if you ever find yourself in Centralia, Pennsylvania, walking through those empty streets, watching the smoke rise from the earth, remember that beneath your feet, deep in the darkness, something is buried there, something dangerous, something that men gave their lives to protect you from. And remember that heroes don't always come home. Sometimes they stay in the darkness, standing watch, long after everyone else has forgotten they existed. Thomas Brennan was declared legally dead in 1991, 7 years after his disappearance. There was no funeral. His body was never found. The fire in Centralia still burns. As of November 2024, 4 people still live in the town, refusing to leave. The mine entrances are sealed. The tunnels are condemned. The underground fire continues its slow consumption of everything beneath. Someday there will be nothing left, just ash and memory. And perhaps that's exactly what my grandfather wanted. Some things should stay buried. Some secrets should burn. Some doors should never be opened. This is the story of one man who made sure they never were. This is the story of Thomas Brennan, guardian of the deep, protector of the forgotten. This is the story of my grandfather, the hero no one will ever know.